Hello guys and welcome back. In this Jetpack Compose tutorial, we're going to see how we can create a splash screen in Jetpack Compose. We'll create a splash screen with two ways, and every way has its pros and cons, so stick around to see which is the best way to create a splash screen in Jetpack Compose. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, now let's create here a new content class file, and this one we're just going to call it landing page. And inside here, we can just create here our new composable, and we can just call it landing page. So here inside our landing page here, we can pass in parameters. So we can just pass in first the modifier, and we can make this to be a default modifier. And also here now we want to provide a callback that is going to help us to finish up the splash screen. And here we can just pass in the on timeout. And this one is just going to return a unit here. So for that case here, now we can just create our simple UI here by passing inside here a box. And we can just use here our modifier. And here now we can just make it to fill match size, and also we can just provide, for example, background color. And for our case here, we can just pass in color green. And also here we can just align the content to be alignment center. Okay, so now here our content are going to be aligned to the center. So what we want to do here now, we want to get the function that is going to be remembered, so that whenever the time changes, we just finish up our execution. So you can just pass in here the current timeout. And basically here now we can pass in the on timeout. So whenever this function is going to change, we can just recompose our composables here. And for that case, now we can just use a LaunchedEffect. So a LaunchedEffect, this is going to relearn when the key is going to change. So whenever the key changes, then this LaunchedEffect is going to be cancelled and rerun again. Now for our case, we're just passing here unit. So this one is not going to change when it's going to be executed once, then after that it's not going to change again. And we can just delay this for 200 milliseconds. So basically, we're going to delay this execution for 2 seconds and make our splash screen visible to the user. And now we can just create here our current timeout, and we can just invoke here our function so that we can just cancel here our execution. And for that case here, now we can just pass in here our image to make this one is going to be displayed inside the splash screen. So you can just get a little creative here by adding other things which you want. So for our case, we're just going to pass in here data resource ID, and I'm going to use a drawable. And for this case, I'm going to use my own logo. So you can just use any type of image or a vector. And basically here now we can just pass in now. Now for our case here, now we have our LaunchedEffect, and we have our landing page ready to use. Now let's jump to the main activity and try to use this landing page. Okay, now we want to create a state that is going to help us to decide between showing the splash screen and the main content. So what we can try to do here, now we can just create enum class, and this one we are just going to call it splash state. And here we're just going to have two options, which is shown and completed. Okay, now we can just come beside here and create another composable that is going to be our main screen. Okay, so now we want to show two contents. So we want to animate between showing the splash screen and showing the main content. And the best candidate of animating this is just using the transitional API. So we can just create here a state that is going to help us to create these animations. So we can just create here a transition state. And here basically we're just creating a mutable transition state. And here we can just make the splash state to start with the shown. And for this case here, now we can just create here our transition. And we can use here the update transition state. And basically here now we can just pass in the transition state. And here we can just pass in our label. Okay, now we want to create a cross-fed animation between the content and the splash screen. So we can just create here two states. So we can animate here the content. So first we can just animate the splash And here we want to animate the float. And basically here now we can pass in the transition specification. We're going to use here a twin animation. And we can make the duration to be 100 milliseconds. And also this requires us to pass in here the label. And here basically now we can just check if this state is going to be equal to SplashScreen shown. Then we want to start from 1 if. So we're just going from full opacity. Then we're just going to 0 opacity. So we want to animate the visibility. And for that case, here we have already created our fading out animation. So we can just make this to fade in. And here we can just call this content alpha. And here we can just increase this fin animation here to 300, for example. And we can just change this from splash animation to content alpha. And here now we want to change this. So this is just going to start from 0F. And we can directly go to increase the opacity up to 100%. Okay, now here we can just create a box. And if you have a screen that is going to be the main content, so for our case, we can just create this. We have here our modifier, and then we have passed inside here our content, which is going to be a box. And this box contains a surface and an image inside there. So we will have a complex screen there, but for our case, we're just going simple. And here now we can just call our landing page. And here basically now we can just pass in our modifier. And here we can pass in the alpha, and here we can pass in the splash alpha. And also here now we want to change our transition state. And basically here now we can pass in SplashScreen completed. So here we have our state, which is going to be input inside there. And now we can just call here our start screen. And here we have our content screen, and we can just pass in here the modifier. And also can pass in the alpha modifier, and we can pass in here the content alpha. So for our case here, this modifier is going to be used here. Okay, now let's call here our main screen inside our set content before we launch up. So we can just call here our main screen. And for this case, let's run here our application inside our application and see. Okay, now our app is launched and the splash screen is going to be shown, and then it's going to navigate off to the main square. But as you can see here, you can spot here there is problems. So the first screen is going to show up is first white, then showing the splash screen, and then it's going to show up the main content. So this is not good because the views are going to be laid out when the onStart command is going to be called. And here we have just a white black screen which is going to be showing up. So let me implement the SplashScreen API, which is going to help us to display a splash screen without showing the white space bar. Now let's just see this. So using this method, we have the customization freedom, which we can try to make anything which we want. However, we just going to show the white screen. So in order to avoid showing up the white screen when we launch up the splash screen, is to use the SplashScreen API. And this SplashScreen API was introduced to Android 12. And for now, there is a compatibility layer that is going to help us to run it until API level 23. So to solve this problem of showing up the white screen, we have to use that SplashScreen API. So you can just navigate here to build.gradle file, and you can just come to module app, and below here now we can just add this dependency here. So we have the AndroidX.core core-splashscreen version 1.00 beta 01. So it is in beta stage, and I think anytime soon it's going to go to a stable release. Now we can just sync here our file, and we can just start. So now let's come here to this Android manifest file. And when we come to this, you can see that we are just using the theme here. And this one is going to be used with the whole application. And this one is just defined in terms of XML. And you can be wondering that we have another theme that is being defined inside Jetpack Compose. And this one is just going directly to use this in terms of Jetpack Compose. So for our case, this API uses this theme here to modify the items. So let's create here another theme which is going to help us to define the splash screen. So we can just create here a new style, and this one we're just going to call it starting. And here now we can just customize and create our items, which is going to help us to define that splash screen. So first and foremost, we can just create here the background color. And here you can just define different colors. So you can just come here, for example, to this purple here. So for my case, I have defined this green here. So you can just press this button here and you can just choose any color which you want. And you have selected here your color. So our background color here, we can just pass in here the color to be green. And after that, we can just provide the icon which we want. So we can just pass in here window icon. And here we have the animated icon. So we can just pass in here the animated icon or a normal icon. So for my case, I have just a normal icon. So I can just use a drawable, and I have defined this icon here. So you could have any type of icon and you just define it inside there. And for that case, now we can just, so if you have an animated icon, you could define here the duration. So for example, here you have the animation duration, and here basically you can just define your duration. So for my case, I'm just using a normal, so I'm just going to delete this. So what we have here, we can just define, for example, the post splash screen. And here is just the theme which is going to be used by the rest of the application. And for case, we have already defined this here by default. So you can just pass in here theme.SplashScreen tutorial. And after that, so when this finishes to execute, this is going to use directly this theme here. Now for that case, we can just come back here to our Android manifest file. And inside here, our activity, we can just try to change this to use another theme. So this one is going to help us to execute that splash screen. Then after that, it's just going to use the normal splash screen by the rest of the application. Now let's just cross this. So in order to show that splash screen, we can just come here directly to our before the super.onCreate method, and we can just install the splash screen. So we can just create here a variable, and we can just call this splash. And here we can just call in installSplashScreen. And basically here now we have to install our splash screen, and we can just customize this by providing animations. So we can just come here before the set content, and we can keep this set on exit animation listener. So for our case here now we can just come inside here and perform animations. So we have here our splash screen viewer. So we can just rename this reference here to splash, and we can use this splash screen view, and we can just get the icon. So for example, here we have our icon view, so we can use this icon view to perform here different animations. So for our case here, we can just use this animate, and inside here now we can just animate. For example, we can just set the duration 300 milliseconds or 200 milliseconds. And also we can just provide here, for example, the scale X. So you want this to shrink up, we can just make it to be 5F. And here, for example, we can just use scale by. And basically here now we are just going to create the shrinking animation. And also we can just add in the fading animation. So we can just pass inside here alpha, and we can just make it to be 0F. With end action. So for our case here now we have to remove this splash viewer after we finish up to show this animation. So you can just come here to splash screen viewer, and we can just remove this. And basically here now we can just call our set content inside here. So instead of just calling it outside here, so we can just come inside here with end action, and also we can just pass in this set content. Okay, now after that, we can just start our animation here. And basically here, we're just going to show up our screens. Now for this case, let's try to run our application and see the output. And as you can see here, we're just seeing two splash screen. So because we have not removed that splash screen, so we can just come here and remove this landing page here. And let's try to rerun again and see. Okay, now, as you have seen there, we have solved the problem of showing up the white screen first, and we have been able to animate our splash screen. So this is just the best way, in my opinion, to implement a splash screen if you want to incorporate it inside your application. And as you have seen that when you have another splash screen, which you implemented inside the Jetpack Compose. So starting from Android 12, by default, the Android system is going to use this SplashScreen API. So if you don't provide the mechanism and you use, for example, the Jetpack Compose part, which we have used earlier there, so you're going to have two splash screens that are going to be displayed. And this is just not really good. So to solve the problem, just use this SplashScreen API. So for now, let's leave it here. See you in the next video.